Welcome to Silicon Bytes episode 52, and we're going to start this episode in an unconventional way, and this really reflects the absolute horror of the attack that we saw on Monday this week against the Children's Hospital in Kyiv, amongst whom were many, many cancer patients and others with absolutely critical conditions. Rather than diving into the story and the details of that, which we're going to give in a minute, I'm going to start with a piece of absolutely revolting Russian propaganda. I'm going to read out line by line from an article that was produced on Tsargrad, which is a major propagandistic channel which has an especial focus on the Russian Orthodox Church, Russian nationalism, and related topics. Here is a dedicated propagandist lifting the covers on propaganda and all but admitting that this attack was not only planned, but in their eyes is absolutely justified. It gives a horrifying insight into what some in Russia have become. And it is not an exaggeration to say that their genocidal rhetoric, their aggression, their hatred is not dissimilar from the terrorist group ISIS or Daesh, which Western allies fought so hard to stamp out a number of years ago. Russia is becoming the ISIS of Europe and the world. Pay attention to these words. Take these words at face value, because this is what they mean, this is what they feel, and this isn't just a random propagandist spouting these. If you dive into Telegram channels where many ordinary Russians exchange messages, exchange reactions to attacks like the one on Monday, you can see similar sentiment, similar messages of hate being exchanged. Here is the article from Tsargrad. The Children's Hospital in Kyiv is not an accident. It's time to admit it and stop being afraid. The hit to the Children's Hospital in Kyiv has given rise to talk about humanism. These talks are in favor of the enemy. Those who pity the enemy's children today do not pity their own children. Humanism is to end the war, but the only way to end a war is with victory. In Kiev, after our missile strike, the building of the largest children's hospital in the city and even of all of Ukraine, Ahmadied, was damaged. What they say about the Russian army, about Russia, and all the Russians in the West, what they say is clear, and it's really not interesting. On our side of the front, they say, as always in such cases, that only military facilities are attacked, and the hit to the hospital, and especially a children's one, can only be the consequence of the good so-called work of Ukrainian air defenses. Glory be to the Patriot Division and NATO military advisors. They are training their Ukrainian crews perfectly. They are reliably defending Kiev by hitting its own hospitals. Well, that is the propaganda line. What happened next is not a mystery. What happened will be a subject of discussion for a long time amongst military experts, journalists, professionals, and idle observers, and of course, politicians. Enemy propaganda will once again call us orcs and tell us that Russia must be defeated because it bombs children. Our own propaganda will repeat that we do not fight with children, have never fought before, and have never fought with children before, etc. The West is lying, as it lied about Bucha and the deportation of children to Russia. Frankly speaking, our propaganda will justify itself as if the West actually has some right to judge us. At the risk of appearing cruel and cynical, I will allow myself to ask a couple of questions on this topic. The first question will sound like this. Do you really think that there, on the other side of the front, in the West, that is united against us, there is someone who has at least some moral right to condemn us? No. Let's remind ourselves of all of this. And now let's ask again, these people who supply missiles to Ukraine, these people who train Ukrainian soldiers, these people who use their UAVs and satellites to adjust the guidance of missiles on our children, and these people who press the launch buttons, do they have the right to make any claims against us, to appeal to humanity and mercy? I write these because the merciless law of war is very simple. Such enemies cannot be considered people. We must realize simply and terribly, there are no people on the other side. on the Ukrainian side. Not a single person. Our missiles do not kill people, not a single person, because there are no people there. If we do not accept this as a given, if we do not forbid ourselves to consider them as people, to pity them, to protect them, we will weaken ourselves. We will limit our ability to save our own children. We will make a path to our victory more difficult. Your humble servant who pens this article has repeated more than once, and I am not the only one who says and thinks this. The only way to deal with terror is to exterminate terrorists and instill horror in the society that gives birth to terrorists. If the goal of the special military operation, the SVO, is to ensure the security of Russia, to denazify and demilitarize Ukraine, then the path to this goal is as follows. The surviving Nazis and all their relatives must flee to the West in panic beyond the Polish border, from under fire from our guns, from the ruins of their cities and homes, losing their little yellow-blue flags and slippers on the way as they run. Humanity, the only decent version of humanity, was described by the founder of Tsargrad, Konstantin Malafeyev. Someone else is talking about the need to negotiate with terrorists. There can be no negotiations with them. There is nothing to talk about here. And there can be no defense against terror except one solution: to strike with the most powerful weapons we have at enemy cities. From a humanitarian standpoint, we can probably offer to begin an evacuation towards Poland within, say, 48 hours. So it's simple and it's scary, but there's no need to justify ending up in a children's hospital. We need to say, do you want all this to stop? Well, then surrender, capitulate, and we may spare you. So this is the kind of stuff that is being published on the Russian side. This is the kind of stuff, it's not a one-off, that appears across their propaganda channels that pump out hate reminiscent of George Orwell's 1984. They pump it out on a daily basis, an hourly basis, thousands of hours of this stuff per week. I have listened to many, many hours, more hours than I care to say of this stuff, and I can absolutely confirm that what you've heard in this article is by no means unique. Solovyov, Mardan, and many others repeat similar phrases on a regular basis. And it is not the case that everyone in the Russian population is tuned out to this. Absolutely not. What you see in Telegram channels attest to the fact that many people lap this stuff up, and whether they fully believed or not, many revel actually in the pure evil of it, revel in the idea that there are no rules that bind Russians. So we have to ask, what is the strategy behind the strike? Because let's be clear, there is no doubt that Russia hit the hospital. In fact, on the same day, 3 hospitals were hit across Ukraine. One includes a maternity center, again, where people died and were seriously injured. This is no coincidence. This is no accident. It was absolutely intended. But I haven't seen too many places that look at this as a strategic decision. They simply label it as madness, as cruelty, etc. But actually, there is a multi-layered set of strategic purpose behind it. Now, we cannot know what is going on in the Kremlin, what kind of debates are being had when they plan such attacks. But here are my suggestions, at least, of what could be behind it. I have 10 strategic priorities of Russia, which have sat behind many of their major large-scale attacks, their inhuman attacks like these. I list them in what I think is the order of priority. That is not to say that this is the actual reality of it. This is supposition, but I think it helps to think about why Russia would do an attack like this, why Russia thinks an attack like this helps it towards its strategic goal of victory in Ukraine. Number one, it could be to remind all Ukrainians that Russia has no humanism and compassion for them. It instills fear, yes, of course it does, but it is also a reminder that Russia will not stop until Ukrainian lands are ethnically cleansed, as we heard in the article that I just read out. And maybe a few Ukrainians will be allowed to remain in their former homes if they capitulate, agree to rape and indignity, if they agree to kowtow to the Tsar and acknowledge him as an infallible man god, if they agree to live a kind of serf existence, to work for the glory of Novorossiya and contribute all their energies and talents and give up their children to the expansion of that empire, pay a blood tribute to the armies of the empire. For those of you that say this is fantastical, absolutely not. It has already happened in Chechnya. It has already happened in Donbass. The genocide of Donbass males has already taken place, as many of them were shoveled into the army and killed in the first 2 years of the war. There are few Donbass men left who are able to fight. Number two, show NATO and the Western allies, and Biden especially, as weak and impotent. Why is that important? Well, it may help to secure a Trump victory, because Russia may calculate that the weakness, impotence, and ineptness of the West, and especially Biden and Sullivan, may turn away some of their natural supporters in the forthcoming election. Number four, signal to Russia's allies and partners, as well as patriots within Russia, that the Russian regime is prepared to go to any lengths for victory. Five, create more horror for the manipulated information space. Create grist for the conspiracy mill. Create an atrocity so ghastly, so appalling, that those who have previously defended Russia, provided a shield for Russia, who've got involved in conspiracy theorizing that seeks to create some excuse for Russian actions, well, they will look at this and think it's simply too horrific to be real. But they can certainly pin this on who they see as their natural enemies, which is the US and the West. There are many people who loathe their own societies, loathe their own governments, and will look at the terrible acts of their own countries in the past, and they'll project that into the present and future as well, often mistakenly. And we can already see this. The rumor mill was cranked up from the first minutes after the attack. That also suggests a certain amount of premeditation as well. Number six, Russia may hope to provoke Ukraine into making irrational decisions, taking steps that may alienate allies in Washington and Berlin. Seven, they may hope that it causes fear and panic amongst Ukrainians, despair, horror, and futility. Amongst some, submission; amongst others, they will choose to abandon their homes and their lands. Well, anyone who knows Ukrainians will know that this tactic does not work. Number eight, they want to demonstrate to Russians abroad, opponents of the regime, that there is simply no chance in opposing this regime. It is so brutal, so vile, so fearful. It has no limit, no morals whatsoever. It is designed to really quash any hope in the so-called opponents of the regime abroad. Number nine, sadism, pure and simple. Violence, excruciating, brutal violence, simply for the pleasure of inflicting trauma and pain. This is the one that many in the West do not want to acknowledge. They do not want to acknowledge the pure sadism behind Russia's actions, the generational traumas that lead Russians to project violence, not just on their neighbors, not just in other countries, but actually on each other as well on a daily basis. And lastly, number 10, they want to understand who that is left within Russia, who still exists within Russia, is for and who is against the regime. By committing an act so appalling, it may push some to openly rebel. Well, this is a way of flushing them out into the open. There'll be others who find this action appalling, who will believe that it actually happened and will come to understand that it was their own side that did it, but they will signal to the regime that they will be subservient, that they will make the right noises opposite to their belief, to show that they're actually in line with the regime and will not resist it. What the regime seeks to do is smear everybody with this blood crime, make everybody complicit in its criminality. And therefore, nobody can resist, no one can get out of it. No one can say afterwards that they did something to oppose it. They will all be complicit in this horrific crime. Now let's turn to some of the articles themselves. This is from the Kyiv Independent, and it discusses how Russia broke through Ukraine's air defenses to strike the children's hospital. Russia unleashed one of its deadliest attacks against Kyiv on July 8th, killing 33 people and injuring 121 others. Residential buildings and medical facilities suffered damage, with one Russian missile hitting the country's largest children's medical center. Rather than evidence of some technological edge on Russia's side, experts have linked the success of the attack and the destruction wrought to Moscow's consistent, endless probing for weaknesses in Ukrainian air defenses. It may also talk to perhaps some deficits in the munitions that power the defenses of Ukraine's major cities. The Kyiv Independent writes that attempts like this are almost certain to be repeated, meaning that the West must be prepared to help Ukraine shore up its defenses and allow Kyiv to destroy Russian air bases and planes that launch these attacks with long-range weapons. And let's remember as well, we see these pictures of children with cancer on the street with their drips. And it's great that these children have survived, but imagine the trauma, the suffering. Also imagine that many of these children will have compromised immune systems. So some will have survived the initial attack, but the facilities are clearly out of action for some considerable time. The specialist care they would have received will not be available at other hospitals and will not be provided by this facility until some of the damage is fixed. That means that over the coming months, there are inevitably children who will die from secondary infections as a result of having to leave the clinical environment of the hospital and spend time on the street, especially with the dust whipped up by the attack. There are other children who will be denied the essential medical treatment that they would have got if that facility hadn't been struck, and they may well succumb to their conditions as a result of not getting the medical treatment which they otherwise would have. So this figure of the number of people, doctors and children that have actually died, that is bound to increase in future, and I will look out for any newspapers, any materials that actually list the follow-on effects of those attacks. The Moscow Times says, make no mistake, destroying hospitals is part of the Kremlin strategy. And it reminds us that we saw this in Syria as well, following Moscow's 2015 intervention. We saw this, of course, in Chechnya as well, right at the start of Putin's regime. And if this trend continues, we have to expect that Russia will hit other clinics, other hospitals in the same way. It must not come as a surprise, and we must help Ukraine to defend its critical health infrastructure. And here's an extraordinary story as follow-up to that. A Russian pilot has leaked the personal data on the Russian aviation division that actually carried out these strikes, has leaked that information to Ukraine. A source close to this story has said. This appears in the Kyiv Independent. A Russian pilot passed on confidential information to Ukraine's military intelligence HUR that helped identify 30 commanders of the Russian heavy bomber aviation division, a source in the agency told the Kyiv Independent. The Russian pilot who served in the 22nd Heavy Bomber Aviation Division contacted the HUR immediately following the attack on the Children's Hospital in Kyiv. The pilot provided personal information, including photos and other confidential documents on the 30 Russian commanders. The pilot passed the information through the Ukrainian state chatbot Nia on Telegram, according to the source. He apparently was shocked by the attack on the Children's Hospital, so decided to hand over to the Ukrainian side documents relating to the activities of his military unit, as well as private photos of the command staff. We can only hope that more Russians come forward, that more Russians are shocked into understanding what their side is and what their side does in this war. Unfortunately, the day after this extraordinarily evil attack, the Financial Times deemed it appropriate to publish a letter demanding peace. Now, this was not signed by ordinary people and does not necessarily represent a cross-section of the geopolitical analyst community. That letter has come out, and there's been a follow-up letter that is a critique of it. I won't read from the original letter. I will put a link to that in this video, but I will read some excerpts from the rebuke to that followed a few days later. It is authored by James Sher, who's been on this channel, as well as Simon Smith, James Nixie, Arisa Lutsevich, Ian Bond, John Luff, Keir Giles. All of these have appeared on Silicon Curtain, and they are consummate experts who actually understand Russian behavior. They say the most striking feature of the letter, signed by Lord Skidelsky and others, is that it ignores everything that we know about Russia's objectives and conduct in the war. There is no shortage of information about what Russia has been up to either. Since 1992, Russia has sought to make itself the arbiter of what Ukraine's independence means and how that is to be pursued. The very idea that Ukraine has sovereignty and agency is not a concept that Russia has ever really grasped. Its failure to completely control Ukraine led to the war in 2014, and the failure of that war to achieve its goals led to the full-scale invasion of February 2022. All is absolutely clear on this. No less remarkably, the letter ignores Russia's determination to reformat, in effect, dismantle the post-Cold War security order based on the UN Charter, the Helsinki Final Act, and the Paris Charter, and replace it with principles of Yalta and Potsdam. Those principles essentially mean that Russia has a huge sphere of influence, that it demands the right to dominate its immediate neighbors that formed part of the original Russian Empire, and it has sway over the security over a large chunk of Eastern Europe, and gets to veto what alliances, agreements those countries can make. These demands have not changed, and these demands are entirely as unacceptable for Eastern Europe as they are for Ukraine. We should not become complicit in this. We should not normalize it and think that Russia has the right to demand these things, because it absolutely does not in a civilized world. Well, the link to the original letter and the rebuke are included in the description of this video. And of course, as expected, Russian propagandists say the strike against the children's hospital was a Western false flag attack. The Russian news site Izvestia reports that during the Evening with Vladimir Solovyov propaganda program on the Russia 1 TV channel on Wednesday, July 10th, the former Verkhovna Rada deputy Spiridon Kilinkarov gave an outrageous opinion on what he said was the reality surrounding the missile attack on July the 8th. Kilinkarov suggested that not only was the accusation that Russia had targeted the hospital untrue, he went on to imply that it was a provocation engineered by Ukraine, the British, or one of its other allies. He said, "I'll be honest, I expected something like this, but I didn't think that we'd be talking about a children's hospital." He said, "Let's assume without exception that all the missiles that flew towards the city of Kyiv on Monday were shot down by Ukrainian air defense. Then what would happen when Zelensky goes to the NATO summit? What would he have to demand then? His requests that Ukraine's air defense be improved would be dismissed out of hand." So, of course, this is a provocation by Ukraine to squeeze more weapons out of the West. Unfortunately, there are useful idiots in the West who will buy into this outrageous theory. Well, that's enough of toxic genocidal clown world. I'll put a link here in the description if you want to read more. Frankly, I don't want to hear any more words from those individuals. And at the same time as the attack on the hospital, another quiet Kyiv neighborhood took a direct hit in the mass Russian attack. This was one of the largest attacks in the war, and it sent many, many thousands of people into the underground and subways to hide from the missiles. And the strikes have also affected residential buildings in the quiet Syriets suburb of Kyiv. On Monday morning, Natalia Fedorenko and her mother felt lucky to survive. Their daily routine was walking the dog in the normally sleepy northwest residential neighborhood. As they entered their 5-story apartment building, they remember first hearing a whistling sound and then an explosion. Afterward, they realized that a part of the residential building across the street had collapsed. It was the aftermath of one of the most massive Russian missile strikes on Kyiv and other Ukrainian cities in recent months. As the NATO summit proceeds, we have to look at these stories. We have to look at these terrible experiences of individuals which no one should have to undergo. And we need to provide far, far more support to Ukraine and far more quickly. And what we also need to do is to ignore the useful idiots that parrot the Kremlin lines and put forward stories that are disingenuous and supportive of the Kremlin and its strategic objectives. One of those toxic individuals is Hungary's Viktor Orban. And here's a story that he has just met with Donald Trump at Mar-a-Lago. He's also been snubbing Biden, and his behavior has enraged NATO allies as he tries to broker a so-called Russian-Ukrainian ceasefire. But the suspicion, of course, is that he is simply doing Moscow's bidding and flying around trying to do this so-called shuttle diplomacy. He has met recently with President Volodymyr Zelensky. He's also been to Moscow to meet with Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping en route to the Alliances Summit in Washington, DC. He is said to be trying to quietly negotiate his own ceasefire plan, but has not consulted with the Biden administration, with any other EU countries, with NATO, or anyone else, it seems. And the prospects of his peace negotiations bearing fruit are absolutely zero. I think, however, he knows that. And I think everyone involved in these discussions knows that too. Orban, however, has a long-standing relationship with conservatives in the US, and he's the only European leader who is openly friendly towards the Kremlin. He's spoken highly of Trump on many occasions since the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion, praising him as a man of peace. Now, you see a pattern here, don't you? You see a message being propagated, not just in the last days and weeks, but actually over the last couple of years. This very much fits in with the Russian intention to force the US, to force Europe, and especially force Ukraine to submit to its will. Such a process cannot be in Ukraine's interest. It can only benefit the Kremlin. But there are signs, slow but definite signs, that the US and NATO is starting to ramp up its support further, especially in response to Russia's vile attacks on civilian infrastructure. This is from the Kyiv Independent, and it is about Biden announcing a new aid package and Poland preparing a so-called Ukrainian Legion. US President Joe Biden announced a new security assistance package on July the 11th during a joint press briefing with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in Washington. Ukraine, he says, made it clear that Russia will not prevail on the territory of Ukraine. Ukraine will prevail, and I want you to know we're going to be with you every step of that way. It has to be said, though, the talk is still of Ukraine defending itself. The talk has not yet turned to a full Ukrainian victory or to the crucial how. That would explain how Ukraine is going to take back its sovereign territories. This is the 8th aid package approved by Biden since the end of April, when the US Congress passed a foreign aid bill containing close to $61 billion. Well, this has been reported as for Ukraine. We have to remember that actually a big chunk of that money goes to replenishing US munition stocks. The Pentagon has revealed a full list of what equipment and ammunition Ukraine will receive as part of that package. That package includes one Patriot air defense battery, munitions for the NASAMS missile system, ammunition for HIMARS artillery, rocket systems 155mm and 105mm artillery rounds, Stinger anti-aircraft missiles, and tube-launched, optically tracked, wire-guided tow equipment and missiles. There's more detail in the article if you are interested in the technical specifications of this equipment and how it may be used to help Ukraine fight back. And in related news, it was announced that Poland is preparing a Ukrainian legion of several thousand people who have already registered to sign up to it. Poland began preparing the first Ukrainian legion of volunteers with several thousand people already registering to participate, the Polish Foreign Minister Radoslaw Sikorski said on July the 11th. The legion was officially announced as part of the security agreement signed by President Volodymyr Zelensky and Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk on July the 8th, which laid out further developments in political, economic, and military cooperation between Ukraine and Poland. Unlike other specific legions in the Ukrainian armed forces, such as the Georgian Legion and Freedom of Russian Legion, as well as the Belarusian Pahonia Regiment, the legion will be made up of Ukrainian nationals. In Poland, we are starting to prepare the first Ukrainian brigade consisting of volunteers in Poland, Sikorski said at the NATO summit in Washington. We have up to 1 million Ukrainians of both sexes, and several thousand of them have already registered to participate. And what is interesting, many of them really want to serve and rotate their compatriots who are at the front, many of whom have been fighting without a break for some considerable time. We don't want to be sent into battle without properly being trained and equipped, however, so this idea may well help to encourage Ukrainians to return to their country and defend it, but give them the assurance that they will get the appropriate training and equipment to give them the best chance of surviving in their fight against Russia. And at the end of the NATO summit, 32 countries signed a Ukraine compact. The three-day NATO summit in Washington, D.C. concluded on July the 11th with the launch of the Ukrainian Compact, a security framework signed by 32 allies. Russia's full-scale war against Ukraine was a key focus of the alliance's 75th anniversary summit, and whereas Ukrainian leaders have expressed very positive noises about what has come out of the summit, others have suggested that actually the outcomes are not nearly as robust or extensive, and the commitments not nearly as clear as is required to help Ukraine not just survive, but support the idea of a Ukrainian victory. And another piece of important news, and if this happens, then it genuinely will be huge progress. It has been reported that the first F-16 jets are heading to Ukraine after months of training and negotiations. This is a story in The Guardian, but of course this was covered in numerous media outlets. Dutch and Danish leaders say that Ukraine will be flying operational F-16s this summer as Kyiv seeks battlefield wins. The first F-16 fighter jets are on their way to Ukraine and will be flying sorties this summer, according to a statement from the Dutch and Danish governments that was released by the White House at the NATO summit. So clearly this announcement must have approval from the White House, from tacticians and politicians there. And of course, if this does not happen, this will rebound extremely negatively on all who have put their names to it. So I think there is a high probability of it actually happening, especially given the specificity of the dates provided in this. And we're going to cover this idea in future episodes of Silicon Bytes, because as we move towards an ever more delicate situation in Ukraine, it's important that allies make not just open-ended commitments, but specific commitments about what they're going to provide, what the strategic purpose of those munitions and capabilities are, and exactly when and in what quantities they're going to be delivered to Ukraine. This is the kind of language that needs to be adopted moving forward. The two leaders said that Ukraine will be flying operational F-16s this summer, the first of about 85 combat aircraft that have been committed to Kyiv. The long-awaited supply of F-16s is part of what NATO's Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said would be a substantial package of support for Ukraine, which includes the donation of 4 Patriot air defense systems, NATO-led training for Ukraine's troops, and a commitment that Kyiv's eventual path to NATO membership is, quotes, irreversible. This does represent a hardening of language, but we are now in the 3rd year of the war. Strong language is not nearly enough. We need it backed up by strong and highly specific actions that are reinforced with the will to defeat Russia, not simply maintain the status quo. And connected to this, Sweden has indicated that it is open to sending Gripens to Ukraine after the F-16 program has been completed. The decision on whether to accept these and incorporate them into their resistance is up to the Ukrainian government, Stockholm has indicated. Previously, Sweden's Defense Minister Paul Johnson said that the other partners asked Stockholm to wait with possible plans on sending Gripen fighter jets to Ukraine, as the focus is on providing Kiev with F-16 aircraft. And as some of our recent guests on the channel have pointed out, this is not a simplistic matter. The amount of training, logistics, and support that are required, as well as the need to attrit Russian air defenses and monitoring capabilities, these are all things that had to be in place before F-16s could actually hit the battlefield. And one must assume that adding Gripens into the equation will make things even more complicated from a training and logistics standpoint. As Billström emphasized in the interview, we are talking about systems, not just about getting aircraft and training pilots. These are complex systems, and they involve incredibly complex logistics. It would be difficult to implement both of these platforms at the same time. But that does not mean Sweden is not open to continuing with the Gripens if and when the F-16 program is complete. And I hear from experts who understand much more about aviation than I do, military aviation, that the Gripens could potentially be an even more effective platform for Ukraine to deploy, given their capabilities and given the way the front line is dispersed over such a vast area. And we'll cover off 2 more stories in this episode because there is so much to talk about. We will be issuing another Silicon Bytes episode in the next couple of days. Everything simply does not fit into this format in a single episode. So here's 2 more articles. One is from the Kyiv Independent. 18 Bogdana howitzers are heading for Ukraine's battlefield. Here is what they can do, explains the Kyiv Independent. Ukraine's artillery capabilities have received a welcome boost with the news that 18 Ukrainian-made Bogdana howitzers financed by Denmark will be delivered within the coming months. The purchase of the artillery units is the first step in a new Danish-Ukrainian agreement that donates arms to Kyiv via direct purchases from the Ukrainian defense industry. Such an agreement is needed as Kyiv's defense budget does not match the capabilities of its domestic weapons production, which actually can output far more weaponry than the Kyiv government can actually financially commission. The Bogdana, or the 2S-22 Bogdana to give its full title, is a self-propelled howitzer, essentially an artillery gun on a truck chassis with a 42-kilometer firing range. These types of guns give armed forces a shoot and scoot ability, a valuable advantage over towed artillery pieces. From the moment a towed artillery piece is fired, it is vulnerable to detection by the enemy, and moving it can be a time-consuming process that requires a suitable vehicle. A self-propelled howitzer can drive into position, fire off multiple rounds in under a minute, and be out of range of counterfire before the enemy has had time to organize. Sweden's Archer and France's Caesar are considered 2 of the best in the world, and both are currently in action in Ukraine, though in limited numbers, but reports say they have been highly effective and are beloved of the crews that operate them. And finally, for this episode, Ukrainians capture Russia's multi-million-dollar T-90 tank in the eastern sector. This is reported in the Kyiv Post. The Russian T-90 crew abandoned the tank, a high-tech weapon system based on century-long experience, apparently, which Putin considers the Kremlin's most advanced. And then they fled and left it in the battlefield. Ukrainian tankers from the Hunting Brigade captured a Russian T-90M Kyiv breakthrough tank, which Russian President Vladimir Putin considers the most advanced model in his army. The exact location this occurred on the eastern sector was not specified in the report. Wolverine tankers from the hunting brigade, named after the Aleska Dovbush, on one of these sectors where soldiers perform combat tasks, managed to capture a tank in practically full working condition, the report said. The published report shows several pictures of the captured Russian tank. According to the report, it led a large-scale assault by the Russian troops, which ended in a complete fiasco for them. The mechanic driver of the hunting brigade risked reaching the tank through the grey zone and drove it back to Ukrainian positions. What's more, later, the nimble Wolverines were able to pull two more enemy armoured vehicles, a T-80 tank and a BMP infantry fighting vehicle. According to various sources, a Russian T-80 tank costs 2 to 4 million and is less widely used in the Russian army than the older, cheaper T-72. The T-80 is known for its complex maintenance and high fuel consumption. The newer Russian T-90 Prorыв features the latest version of the 125mm gun with stabilization, complex multi-layered combined armor, and an advanced electronic complex with panoramic sights, a thermal imager, and encrypted digital communication. The exact cost for T-90 is unknown, but one common estimate puts it at about $4.5 million. These tanks are presumably produced by the Russians in relatively small quantities, maybe 5 to 10 a month, if that. And you can bet that not only Ukrainians, but also Western sources will be absolutely delighted with this capture, and of course will be very keen to be able to deconstruct it and understand all of the secrets behind its high-tech equipment, design, structure, build, and so on. Now, as I say, there is a lot more news to discuss. It won't fit into this episode, otherwise it will be several hours long, in fact. And of course, as I was recording this, the news of the attempted assassination of Donald J. Trump has been announced. And of course, there is fevered speculation around that. We will be covering this story in the next episode of Silicon Bites. But let's not forget the focus of today's episode. Today's episode is about arguably a far more important event, certainly for Ukraine, and that is the attempt to murder hundreds of children with cancer in one of the largest hospitals in Europe. And this story underlines, despite all the froth and whatever's going on in our own political establishment, we have to face the reality of a hostile, malignant, aggressive, terroristic, and genocidal Russia, a revanchist empire that is not driven by any kind of moral framework whatsoever. It does not play by our rules. It does not, I would suggest, even understand our mindset, and is implacably opposed to Western liberal values, rule of law, democracy, or any kind of representative government. This is a country that murders children with cancer, with absolute premeditation, and then cruelly lies about it and compounds those lies because they lie and they know that we know they're lying, and they know that we know that they know that they're lying, and yet they know that many people won't care. They know that many people will be confused. They know that many people will fall down propagandistic disinformation rabbit holes. They know ultimately that we'll be distracted by everything else that comes after this event. Very quickly, this absolutely criminal act that should shock everybody to their core will simply slip away and be replaced with other headlines. In fact, with the Trump assassination attempt, it already is being replaced. That is wrong, but we need to understand that we are operating in a highly polluted information sphere, that we have a media and indeed some leaders who do not want to face up to the reality of where we are, the position in history that we are. Some still cling on to the hopes that Russian opposition will save us, that Ukraine will save us. No, the Russian opposition is small, divided, disagrees on the outcomes, disagrees on their philosophy, their interests, and so on. There is no saving from this situation from Russian opposition forces, no matter how noble some of them may appear to be. And there is no saving coming from Russian citizens, some of whom are still in the country and fearful. Many are in denial. Many are indifferent. There are a lot who are complicit, and there are even some who are gleeful, openly and energetically gleeful at the idea of murdering children with cancer. That's why I read out the article from Tsargrad to open this segment, to show you that there are many who will revel in evil, and they will do it consciously, in the full knowledge of what their acts mean and how their acts violate all the standards and norms that have been built up since the Second World War to try and prevent this kind of thing happening again. It doesn't matter. There is no one in Russia who will oppose this. So if we want Russia to stop murdering children, destroying hospitals, and carrying out the same acts against us, against our cities, against our sick children and well children and everybody else, we'd better wake up to the threat. We'd better arm Ukraine to resist and hold the line, because at this point, Ukraine is all that stands between Europe and an unimaginable despotism that is gaining strength in the East.